The morning sun painted the sky orange as Jake Harrison stood on his front porch, holding a cup of coffee that looked tiny in his massive hands. At 6 feet 9 inches tall and built like a mountain, Jake was the kind of man who had to duck through doorways and buy his clothes from special stores. His broad shoulders could carry a full-grown calf, and his arms were thick as fence posts from years of ranch work. But size meant nothing when you were eating breakfast alone every morning for the past 5 years. Jake looked out at his land. 3,000 acres of the finest grazing country in Texas. Cattle dotted the rolling hills like brown and black spots on a green canvas. The barn stood solid and red in the distance. Everything looked perfect from the outside. Everything except the empty house behind him. He walked back inside, his boots echoing on the wooden floors. The kitchen felt too big, too quiet. His plate from last night sat in the sink. Another meal eaten standing up at the counter because sitting at the dining table alone felt too sad. The whole house was like that now. Too much space, too much silence. Mrs. Rodriguez had been his housekeeper for 15 years. She cooked, cleaned, and filled the house with Spanish music and the smell of fresh bread. When she retired last month to move closer to her grandchildren, she took all the life out of the place with her. "You need to find someone, mijo," she had said on her last day, using the pet name she'd called him since he was 20. This house needs laughter again. Jake knew she was right, but finding someone wasn't easy when you looked like him. He'd learned long ago that his size scared people. Children hid behind their mothers when he walked by. Women crossed the street when they saw him coming. Even grown men seemed nervous around him, like they expected him to start a fight or break something. The truth was, Jake wouldn't hurt a fly. His own father had been a mean drunk who used his fists instead of words. Jake promised himself he'd never be like that. He kept his voice soft, his movements careful, his temper locked away. But people saw his size first and made up their minds, before he ever got a chance to show them who he really was. After another morning of burnt eggs and bitter coffee, Jake finally gave up. He pulled out his old laptop and stared at the screen for a long time before typing an ad for the local newspaper website. Ranch cook needed. Quiet employer. Good pay. Room and board if wanted. Experience preferred but will train right person. He read it 3 times before hitting send. Then he sat back in his chair and wondered if anyone would even call. Across town, Grace Murphy sat at her tiny kitchen table, staring at the same newspaper website through eyes red from crying. The eviction notice lay next to her laptop like a death sentence. 30 days to pay 3 months of back rent or lose the little apartment that had been her home for 2 years. At 38, Grace had never thought she'd be in this position. She'd been married to Tom for 12 years, a good man who taught high school history and coached baseball. They'd had a simple but happy life. Tom made enough to pay the bills, and Grace worked part-time at the local bakery because she loved making people smile with fresh cookies and warm bread. Then the cancer came. It started as a cough that wouldn't go away. By the time the doctors found it, the disease had spread too far. Tom fought for 8 months, using up all their savings and then some. Grace stayed by his side every day, watching the man she loved fade away like morning mist. When it was over, she discovered just how much the medical bills had destroyed them financially. The house was gone first, then Tom's truck. Now she was down to this 1-bedroom apartment and a beat-up Honda that barely started on cold mornings. The bakery had let her go 2 weeks ago. "Business is slow," the owner said, not meeting her eyes. Grace knew the truth. She'd been crying too much at work, making customers uncomfortable with her sadness. She scrolled through job listings with growing desperation. Most wanted experience she didn't have or paid less than her rent. Then she saw it, the ranch cook position. The pay was more than she'd made at the bakery, and room and board meant she wouldn't need this apartment anymore. Grace had always been a good cook. Tom used to brag about her pot roast and apple pie to anyone who'd listen, but working for a stranger on an isolated ranch? The thought made her stomach twist with anxiety. Still, what choice did she have? She picked up her phone and dialed the number before she could change her mind. "Harrison Ranch," came a deep voice that sounded like distant thunder. "Hello, I'm calling about the cook position." Grace's voice came out smaller than she intended. There was a pause. You have experience? Yes, sir. I worked at Murphy's Bakery for 5 years, and I've been cooking for my family my whole life. Another pause. Can you come out tomorrow for an interview around 10? Grace wrote down the directions with shaking hands. After hanging up, she sat in her empty apartment and wondered what she'd just gotten herself into. The next morning, Grace drove her rattling Honda down a long dirt road that seemed to go on forever. Pastures stretched out on both sides, dotted with cattle that looked up as she passed. The landscape was beautiful in a wild, open way that made her feel even smaller than usual. Then she saw the house. It was huge, a 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch and flower boxes under every window. But it was the man sitting on the porch steps who made her breath catch in her throat. Jake Harrison was the biggest human being she'd ever seen in person. He wore a blue work shirt that strained across his chest and a cowboy hat that looked normal-sized on his massive head. When he stood up to greet her, he seemed to keep rising until he blocked out the sun. Grace's first instinct was to get back in her car and drive away. This giant of a man lived out here alone, miles from town. What was she thinking? But then she saw something that made her pause. He was walking toward her slowly, carefully, like he was trying not to startle a wild animal. His massive hands hung loose at his sides, and he stopped a good 10 feet away from her car. Mrs. Murphy? His voice was gentler than it had been on the phone. Grace nodded, not trusting her voice. I'm Jake Harrison, thank you for coming out. She forced herself to get out of the car, feeling ridiculously small next to him. The top of her head barely reached his chest. But when she looked up at his face, she was surprised by what she saw there. His eyes were kind. Tired, maybe, and a little sad, but kind. And he was looking at her the way most people looked at him, like he was afraid she might run away. Would you like to see the kitchen? He asked, gesturing toward the house. Grace followed him up the porch steps, noticing how he shortened his stride to match hers. The front door was tall enough for him to walk through without ducking, which must have cost extra to build. Inside, the house was beautiful but felt empty, like a museum where no one lived. Family photos lined the mantel over the fireplace, but they all looked old. The furniture was nice, but arranged too perfectly, like no one ever sat on the couch or used the coffee table. The kitchen was a cook's dream. A big gas stove, double ovens, granite countertops, and enough cabinet space for a restaurant. But it felt cold and unused. A single plate and cup sat in the sink. The refrigerator hummed loudly in the silence. Mrs. Rodriguez, my old housekeeper, she kept everything organized, Jake said, opening cabinets to show her where things were. I'm not much of a cook myself. Been living on cereal and sandwiches mostly. Grace ran her hand along the smooth countertop. It's a beautiful kitchen. Would you be comfortable working here? He asked. I know it's isolated. Some folks don't like being so far from town. She looked around the empty kitchen and thought about her empty apartment. At least here, there would be purpose. Someone who needed her cooking. The pay you mentioned, in the ad, she said. Is that negotiable? Jake named a figure that was twice what she'd made at the bakery. Grace tried not to let her relief show on her face. When would you need me to start? Tomorrow, if you're willing. I eat breakfast at 6, lunch at noon, dinner at 7. Pretty simple schedule. Grace nodded. What do you like to eat? For the first time, Jake almost smiled. Whatever you want. To make. I'm not picky. Just tired of my own cooking. They talked for a few more minutes about grocery shopping and meal planning. Jake gave her a key to the house and showed her the small apartment above the garage if she wanted to move in eventually. It was clean and furnished with its own kitchen and bathroom. As Grace drove back to town, she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. Hope. Maybe this would work. Maybe this giant, quiet man with the sad eyes would give her a chance to start over. That night, she packed her few belongings and said goodbye to the apartment that had been her prison of grief. Tomorrow she would start cooking again for someone who needed her. Jake watched her car disappear down the dirt road and felt something shift in his chest. She was so small, so fragile looking, but she hadn't run away. She'd looked him in the eye and asked about the job like she actually wanted it. He went back inside the empty house and tried to imagine it filled with the smell of cooking food. For the first time in months, he was actually hungry for breakfast. Neither of them knew it yet, but their lives had just taken a turn towards something neither had dared to hope for. Sometimes the best things come when you're not looking for them, when you're just trying to survive another day. Sometimes healing begins with something as simple as a home. Grace arrived at the Harrison Ranch at 5:30 the next morning, her hands shaking as she unlocked the front door. The house was dark and quiet, but she could see light coming from what looked like Jake's bedroom upstairs. She moved carefully through the living room, trying not to make noise with her footsteps. In the kitchen, she flipped on the lights and took a deep breath. The morning sun was just starting to peek through the windows, casting long shadows across the countertops. This was it, her first day cooking for the giant cowboy who lived alone in this big, empty house. Grace had barely slept the night before, worrying about what to make for his first breakfast. She'd stopped at the grocery store after their meeting and bought eggs, bacon, fresh bread, and everything she needed for biscuits from scratch. Tom used to say her biscuits could make a grown man cry with happiness. She tied her apron around her waist and got to work. The kitchen felt different in the early morning light, less empty, more full of possibilities. As she mixed biscuit dough and got the coffee started, Grace found herself humming softly. She hadn't hummed while cooking since Tom got sick. At exactly 6 o'clock, she heard heavy footsteps on the stairs. Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, and Grace felt that same little shock at his enormous size. He wore clean jeans and a red flannel shirt that made his shoulders look even broader. "Good morning," he said quietly, like he was afraid of startling her. "Good morning. I hope you're hungry." Jake looked at the plate she set in front of him. Fluffy scrambled eggs, crispy bacon, hash browns, and 2 golden biscuits with butter and honey on the side. Steam rose from the coffee cup she filled for him. "This looks—" He paused, staring at the food. "This looks incredible." Grace watched nervously as he took his first bite. Jake's eyes closed for a moment, and when he opened them, she saw something that looked like relief. "Best breakfast I've had in years," he said simply. Grace felt a warm glow in her chest. "There's plenty more if you want seconds." But Jake was already standing up, grabbing his hat from the hook by the door. "Thank you, Mrs. Murphy. I'll be back at noon." And then he was gone, leaving Grace alone in the big kitchen with a sense that maybe, just maybe, this was going to work out. The first week fell into a rhythm. Grace arrived early every morning, cooked breakfast, and left Jake's payment on the counter with a note telling her what he'd liked about the meal. She never saw him eat. He always took his plate out to the porch or the barn, giving her space to work. At noon, she'd have lunch ready. Jake would appear, nod his thanks, and disappear again with his food. Dinner was the same, polite thanks, then he'd eat alone while she cleaned up the kitchen. Grace didn't mind the solitude. After months of well-meaning neighbors stopping by to check on her, it was nice to work in peace. The kitchen began to feel like hers. She reorganized the spice cabinet, found the good pans hidden in the back of a low cupboard, and started keeping fresh flowers in a mason jar by the window. She learned Jake's preferences without him having to tell her. He liked his coffee strong and black, his eggs over easy, his bacon crispy but not burnt. He ate everything she put in front of him, but she noticed he cleaned his plate fastest when she made comfort foods: meatloaf, pot roast, chicken, and dumplings. The second week, Grace realized she was looking forward to coming to the ranch. The drive through the countryside was peaceful, and the big kitchen had become her sanctuary. She found herself cooking with more care than she had in years, trying new recipes and taking pride in creating meals that would nourish this quiet, lonely man. It was during the third week that things started to change. Grace was making lunch when she heard a commotion outside. Through the kitchen window, she could see Jake in the pasture, trying to help a cow that seemed to be in distress. The animal was down on its side, and Jake was kneeling next to it despite his size, his big hands gentle as he examined the creature. Without thinking, Grace filled a thermos with ice water and walked out to the pasture. She'd never been this far from the house before, and the open space made her feel exposed and small. "Is everything okay?" she called out when she got close enough. Jake looked up, surprised to see her there. His face was red from exertion and worry. "She's having trouble with her calf, been at this for 2 hours." Grace handed him the water, and Jake drank gratefully. "Is there anything I can do?" "Just stay back in case she gets up fast," Jake said, but his voice was softer than usual, like he was glad she was there. For the next hour, Grace watched Jake work. Despite his massive size, he was incredibly gentle with the struggling cow. He spoke to her in a low, soothing voice, his huge hands careful and patient as he helped deliver the calf. When it was over and both mother and baby were safe, Jake sat back in the grass, exhausted. His shirt was soaked with sweat, and there were tears in his eyes. "She reminds me of the first cow I ever delivered by myself," he said quietly. "I was 14 and my dad was too drunk to help. Thought I was going to lose them both." Grace sat down in the grass next to him, not caring about getting dirty. "But you didn't. You saved them." Jake looked at her with surprise. "You're not afraid of getting your clothes messy?" "It's just clothes," Grace said. This was more important. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the calf try to stand on wobbly legs. It was the longest conversation they'd had since she started working for him. "I should get back and finish lunch," Grace said eventually. "Mrs. Murphy," Jake called as she started to walk away. "Thank you for the water and for staying." That afternoon, Jake didn't disappear with his lunch. Instead, he sat at the kitchen island while Grace cleaned up, making small talk about the weather and asking her opinion about adding more shade trees near the house. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Over the next few days, their interactions grew longer. Jake began lingering in the kitchen after breakfast, drinking a second cup of coffee, while Grace planned the day's meals. He started sharing small details about ranch life, which cattle were expecting calves, problems with the fence line, his plans to expand the north pasture. Grace found herself talking too. She mentioned that she'd grown up on a small farm, that she knew something about animals and growing things. She told him about the herb garden she'd always wanted to plant, how she missed baking for people who appreciated it. "There's plenty of space behind the house," Jake said one morning. "If you wanted to start a garden, I could till up the soil for you." Grace looked out the kitchen window at the empty patch of ground he was talking about. "I don't want to impose." "Wouldn't be imposing. I'd like to see something growing back there besides weeds." That weekend, Grace found Jake had not only tilled the soil but had also built raised beds and brought in fresh compost. He'd even installed a water spigot nearby. "You didn't have to do all this," Grace said, touched by the gesture. Jake shrugged, embarrassed. "Figured if you're going to do something, might as well do it right." Grace planted herbs first: basil, rosemary, thyme, and oregano. Then vegetables: tomatoes, peppers, beans, and squash. Jake would find excuses to check on her progress, offering to carry heavy bags of soil or adjust the irrigation he'd set up. It was while they were working in the garden together one evening that Grace realized how much Jake had changed since she'd started cooking for him. He'd gained weight, good weight that filled out his clothes better. His face had more color, and he smiled more often. The deep lines around his eyes had softened. "You look healthier," she said without thinking. Jake paused in his weeding. "Feel healthier too. Been a long time since I've eaten regular meals that didn't come from a can or the microwave. Mrs. Rodriguez never cooked for you?" "She did, but..." Jake struggled for words. "She was more like family, felt different. You cook like you. Care whether I enjoy it or not." Grace felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I do care. I want you to enjoy the food." "Why?" Jake asked quietly. Grace looked at this gentle giant kneeling in the dirt next to her, his massive hands carefully tending tiny seedlings, and realized she didn't have a simple answer to that question. "Because everyone deserves to enjoy their meals," she said finally. "Because food made with care tastes better. Because..." She trailed off, not sure how to finish the sentence. "Because?" Jake prompted. Because you're not what I expected, Grace admitted. When I first saw you, I thought, well, I was scared. You're so big and I'm so small, but you've been nothing but kind to me. Patient. You make me feel safe here. Jake was quiet for a long moment. Most people see the size first, he said. Make up their minds about what kind of person I am before they get to know me. What kind of person are you? Grace asked. Jake considered this seriously. Quiet. I like animals better than most people. I read books about astronomy and watch old movies. I grow flowers behind the barn that nobody knows about. I worry about whether the cattle are comfortable and if the ranch will still be here in 50 years. Grace smiled. You grow flowers? Jake's face turned red. It's just something I do. Can I see them sometime? If you want to, Jake said, surprised. Most people would think it's silly. I don't think it's silly. I think it's beautiful that someone as strong as you chooses to create beautiful things. That evening, as Grace drove home to her tiny apartment, she realized something had shifted between them. They weren't just Emplo. The storm hit on a Tuesday evening in late September. Grace had stayed later than usual to prepare meals for the rest of the week, something she'd started doing to save Jake money on groceries. She was putting the last casserole in the freezer when the first rumble of thunder rolled across the sky. Through the kitchen window, she could see dark clouds building on the horizon like a wall of charcoal. The wind was picking up, bending the trees and rattling the windows. Grace glanced at the clock, almost 8 o'clock. She'd been so focused on cooking that she hadn't noticed how late it had gotten. Jake appeared in the kitchen doorway, concern written across his weathered face. Storm's coming in fast, he said. You should head home before it hits. Grace looked outside again. The sky had turned an ominous green color that she recognized from growing up in tornado country. I think it might be too late for that. If to prove her point, a brilliant flash of lightning lit up the kitchen, followed immediately by thunder so loud it shook the house. Rain began pelting the windows in sheets, and Grace could barely see past the porch through the downpour. You can't drive in this, Jake said, worry clear in his deep voice. Roads will flood, and that little Honda of yours won't make it through the low spots. Grace bit her lip, trying to think of alternatives. She could call someone to pick her up, but who? She didn't have many close friends left. Grief had a way of shrinking your social circle. Her neighbors were polite but distant. There really wasn't anyone she could ask to brave this storm. The guest room upstairs is always ready, Jake said quietly, as if reading her thoughts. Clean sheets, fresh towels. You'd be safe here until morning. Grace felt a flutter of nervousness. Staying overnight at Jake's ranch alone with him in this big house felt like crossing some invisible line, but another crash of thunder made the decision for her. If you're sure it's not too much trouble, she said. No trouble at all, Jake replied, relief evident in his voice. I'll show you where everything is. The power went out just as they reached the top of the stairs. The house plunged into darkness so complete that Grace couldn't see her own hand in front of her face. She heard Jake moving around in the darkness, his heavy footsteps sure and steady. Don't move, he said. I'll get some candles. A moment later, warm light flickered to life as Jake lit a candle in the hallway. The soft glow made everything look different, more intimate, more mysterious. Grace followed him to the guest room, where he lit 2 more candles on the dresser. Bathroom's right. Across the hall, Jake said. There are extra blankets in the closet if you get cold. The house gets drafty in storms like this. Thank you, Grace said. I'm sorry to put you out like this. You're not putting me out, Jake said firmly. Then softer. Actually, it's nice to have company during a storm. Gets lonely out here when the power's out. Grace looked at him in the candlelight. Without the harsh overhead lights, his face seemed softer, younger somehow. The scars and weathered lines that spoke of years of hard work were still there. But they told a story of strength, rather than harshness. Are you hungry? She asked. I could make us some sandwiches. The gas stove will still work. Jake's face brightened. That sounds good. I was so worried about you getting home safe that I forgot all about dinner. They made their way back downstairs, by candlelight, Grace carrying one candle while Jake carried two others. The kitchen looked completely different in the flickering light, warmer, cozier, like something from an old movie. Grace found everything she needed to make grilled cheese sandwiches and heat up some soup. Jake sat at the kitchen island, watching her work by candlelight. It felt strangely intimate, this simple meal preparation in the near darkness. "I can't remember the last time I cooked by candlelight," Grace said as she flipped the sandwiches. "My mom used to cook this way sometimes," Jake said quietly. "When I was little and the power would go out, she'd make it feel like an adventure instead of something to be scared of." It was the first time Jake had mentioned his mother without prompting. Grace glanced at him as she ladled soup into bowls. "How old were you when she passed?" 20. Cancer took her just like—" Jake stopped himself. "Just like it took Tom," Grace finished softly. "It's okay to say it. Cancer isn't a forbidden word around me." They ate their simple meal in comfortable silence, listening to the storm rage outside. The rain pounded on the roof, and the wind howled around the corners of the house. But inside, with the candles flickering and the warm food between them, Grace felt safer than she had in months. "Jake," she said as they finished eating, "can I ask you something personal?" He nodded, his eyes reflecting the candlelight. "Why haven't you ever married? I mean, you're successful, you're kind, you have all this." She gestured around the house. Jake was quiet for so long that Grace thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "Hard to find someone who isn't afraid of you," he said. "And harder still to find. Someone who sees past the size to whatever else might be there." Grace felt her heart squeeze at the loneliness in his voice. "Jake, you're one of the gentlest people I've ever met. Any woman would be lucky to—" "Would you?" Jake interrupted, then immediately looked horrified at his own words. "I'm sorry, I shouldn't have asked that. That was inappropriate." Grace stared at him across the small table. In the candlelight, his face was vulnerable in a way she'd never seen before. This giant of a man who could probably lift a car over his head was looking at her like he was afraid she might disappear. "Would I what?" she asked softly. "Be afraid," Jake said, his voice rough with emotion. "Of someone like me. Someone who takes up too much space and scares children and can't even buy clothes in a regular store." Grace reached across the table and placed her small hand over his enormous one. His skin was rough from years of ranch work, but warm and surprisingly gentle. "Jake Harrison," she said firmly, "I was afraid of you for about 5 minutes on the day we met. Since then, you've shown me nothing but kindness and respect. You've given me a job when I desperately needed one. You've never made me feel uncomfortable or unsafe, and you built me a garden with your own hands just because I mentioned wanting one." Jake stared down at their joined hands. "Most women want someone closer to their own size, someone who doesn't stick out in a crowd." "Most women haven't had the chance to get to know you," Grace said. "And honestly, after being married to someone my own size, I can tell you that a person's heart matters a lot more than how tall they are." Jake looked up at her then, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "Grace?" It was the first time he'd used her first name, instead of calling her Mrs. Murphy. The way he said it, soft and wondering, made something flutter in her chest. "Show me," she said impulsively. "Show you what?" "The flowers. You promised to show me your flower garden." Jake blinked in surprise. "Now, in the storm?" "The storm's letting up," Grace said. And it was true. The thunder was more distant now, and the rain had softened to a steady patter. "And we have candles." Jake hesitated. "It's my private place. I've never shown it to anyone." "Then I'm honored that you're willing to share it with me." Jake studied her face in the candlelight as if trying to decide whether she really meant it. Finally, he stood up. "All right, but we'll need jackets." They bundled up in coats from the mudroom and stepped out into the night. The air was clean and cool after the storm, smelling of rain and earth. Jake carried a battery-powered lantern that cast a wider circle of light than the candles. Behind the barn, hidden from view of the house and road, was Jake's secret garden. Grace gasped when the lantern light revealed what he'd been hiding. Roses, of every color imaginable climbed wooden trellises and spilled over stone borders. Jasmine vines wound around pergolas, their sweet scent heavy in the night air. Peonies, irises, and lilies were planted in careful arrangements that would bloom in succession through the seasons. A small stone bench sat in the center, surrounded by the most beautiful flowers Grace had ever seen. "Jake," she breathed. "This is incredible." Jake set the lantern on the bench and looked around nervously. "It's probably silly for a man like me to spend time on flowers." "It's not silly at all," Grace said firmly. "It's beautiful. How long have you been working on this?" 10 years or so. Started it after my mom died. She always said flowers were proof that God wanted the world to be beautiful, not just functional. Grace walked slowly through the garden, touching the rain-wet petals gently. She was right. "Jake, you have such a gift. This is like something from a magazine." "It's just something I do when the ranch work is done. Helps me think." Grace turned to look at him. In the lantern light surrounded by his beautiful flowers, Jake looked different. Less like the intimidating giant she'd first met and more like, well, like a man who understood beauty and wasn't afraid to create it. "What do you think about?" she asked. Jake was quiet for a moment, looking around at his flowers. "Lots of things. Whether I'm doing right by the land, what my parents would think of the man I've become, whether I'll always be alone out here." "You're not alone right now," Grace said softly. Jake looked at her then, really looked at her, like he was seeing her for the first time. Grace felt something shift in the air between them, something electric that had nothing to do with the storm that had just passed. The morning after the storm dawned bright and clear, as if the world had been washed clean. Grace woke up in the guest room feeling more rested than she had in months. Sunlight streamed through the windows, and she could hear Jake moving around, downstairs probably getting ready for his morning chores. She dressed quickly and made her way to the kitchen, where she found Jake standing by the coffee maker with his back to her. He turned when he heard her footsteps, and Grace felt that same little flutter in her chest that had kept her awake half the night. "Morning," he said, his voice softer than usual. "Coffee's almost ready." "Thank you for letting me stay," Grace said. "I slept better than I have in ages." "Good bed in that room," Jake said, then seemed to realize how that might sound. His cheeks reddened slightly. "I mean, it's comfortable. The mattress. The room." Grace hid a smile at his flustered response. This gentle giant who could handle a 1,000-pound bull was getting tongue-tied talking to her about a bed. "It was perfect," she assured him. "Should I make breakfast, or did you want to eat something quick before your morning rounds?" "I've got time for a real breakfast," Jake said. "If you don't mind cooking, I could help." "You could keep me company," Grace suggested. "If you want to." Jake's face brightened. "I'd like that." As Grace worked, Jake sat at the kitchen island, sipping his coffee and talking about his plans for the day. There was an easiness between them that hadn't been there before, like the storm had washed away some invisible barrier. "The creek's probably running high after all that rain," Jake said. "I should check the bridge on the north pasture, make sure it's still secure." "Is it dangerous when it floods?" Grace asked, cracking eggs. Into a bowl, can be. "Few years back we lost 2 calves that got caught on the wrong side when the water came up fast." Grace turned to look at him. "That must have been heartbreaking." Jake nodded slowly. "Worst part of ranching is losing animals. You try to protect them, but sometimes nature has other plans." "Like people," Grace said quietly. Their eyes met across the kitchen, and Grace knew Jake was thinking about loss too. About his mother. Maybe about other people who had come and gone from his life. About the loneliness that had been his companion for so many years. "Yeah," Jake said softly. "Like people." Grace served breakfast, and, for the first time since she'd started working at the ranch, Jake didn't take his plate and disappear. Instead, he stayed at the counter eating while they talked about everything and nothing. The weather, Grace's garden, a book Jake was reading about sustainable farming. "I should let you get to work," Grace said when they'd finished eating. "Actually," Jake said, standing up, "would you like to come with me today? To check the creek, I mean, if you're not too busy." Grace felt a warm glow at the invitation. I'd love to. They took Jake's truck, a big Ford that made Grace feel tiny in the passenger seat but gave her a perfect view of the ranch lands. Jake drove slowly, pointing out landmarks and telling her stories about different parts of the property. My great-grandfather bought this land in 1923, he said, as they bumped along a dirt road. Paid for it with money he made bootlegging during Prohibition. Really? Grace laughed. Your great-grandfather was a criminal? Prefer to think of him as an entrepreneur, Jake said with a grin. He saw a need and filled it, though my great-grandmother made him promise to go legitimate once he had enough to buy the ranch. Smart woman. The Harrison women usually are. Mom used to say the men in our family were blessed with strong backs and good hearts. But we needed smart wives to keep us out of trouble. Grace felt something twist in her stomach at the mention of wives. Were you ever close to getting married? Jake was quiet for a long moment, focusing on the road ahead. Once, he said finally. Her name was Rebecca. We dated for 2 years. What happened? She wanted me to sell the ranch, move to the city. Said I was wasting my potential hiding out here with a bunch of cows. Jake's voice was carefully neutral, but Grace could hear the old hurt underneath. When I told her I couldn't do that, couldn't leave this place, she said she wasn't going to waste her life waiting for me to grow up and want something better. I'm sorry, Grace said. That must have been difficult. At the time, yeah, but looking back, I think she did us both a favor. She would have been miserable here, and I would have been miserable anywhere else. They reached the creek, which was indeed running high and fast from the storm. Jake walked along the bank, checking the fence line and the small bridge that crossed to the north pasture. Grace followed, enjoying the cool morning air and the sound of rushing water. Bridge looks solid, Jake said, jumping up and down on the wooden planks to test them. Should handle the cattle just fine. Jake, Grace said as they walked back toward the truck, can I ask you something? Sure. Do you ever get lonely out here? I mean, it's beautiful, but it's so isolated. Jake stopped walking and looked out over his land, the rolling hills dotted with cattle, the creek winding through the valley, the mountains rising in the distance. Used to, he said, but not so much lately. What changed? Jake turned to look at her, and Grace felt her breath catch at the intensity in his eyes. You did, he said simply. The words hung in the air between them like a bridge. Neither was sure they were ready to cross. Grace felt her heart racing, torn between the urge to step closer to him and the instinct to protect herself from getting hurt again. Jake. I know it's complicated, he said quickly. I know you're still grieving Tom and I'm your employer, and there's 100 reasons why this is probably a bad idea. But Grace, these past few months with you here, it's the first time in years that I've looked forward to coming back to the house at the end of the day. Grace stared at him, this gentle giant who was offering her his heart like it was something fragile and precious. She thought about Tom, about the guilt she carried for even entertaining feelings for another man. She thought about the difference in their sizes, their backgrounds, what people would think. And then she thought about the way Jake had built her a garden without being asked, the patience he'd shown teaching her about ranch life, the tenderness she'd seen in his hands as he'd delivered that calf. Jake, she said softly, I care about you too, more than I expected to, more than I thought I was ready for. Hope flared in Jake's eyes. But I'm scared, Grace admitted. Tom and I were together for 12 years. He was the only man I've ever loved. I don't know how to do this with someone else. Jake stepped closer, close enough that Grace had to tilt her head back to look at his face. I don't know how to do this at all, he said. I've never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. It scares me too. They stood there by the creek, looking at each other like they were seeing each other for the first time. Grace could feel the pull between them, stronger than ever now that they'd put words to it. What do we do? She whispered. I don't know, Jake said. Maybe we figure it out as we go? Grace felt herself leaning toward him, drawn by something stronger than fear or doubt. Jake's hand came up to cup her face, his thumb brushing across, her cheek with impossible gentleness for someone so large. "Grace," he said, her name barely a whisper. She rose up on her toes, and he bent down, and their lips met in a kiss that was tender and desperate and full of all the loneliness they'd both been carrying for so long. Grace had forgotten what it felt like to be kissed by someone who wanted her, really wanted her. Jake's arms came around her, holding her like she was precious, like she might disappear if he didn't hold on tight enough. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "Wow," Grace said softly. "Yeah," Jake agreed. "Wow." They drove back to the house in comfortable silence, both of them lost in their own thoughts. Grace kept stealing glances at Jake, seeing him differently now. Not just as her employer or even her friend, but as a man who had feelings for her, who had just kissed her, like she was the answer to every prayer he'd ever prayed. The rest of the day passed in a blur of shared looks and casual touches that felt electric. Jake helped Grace in the garden, his presence next to her making even simple tasks feel charged with possibility. Grace cooked dinner with extra care, wanting to create something special for this man who had just turned her world upside down. That evening, as Grace was getting ready to drive home, Jake caught her hand. "Stay," he said. "I mean, I don't mean," he took a deep breath. "I just mean I'd like more time with you today. We could watch a movie or just talk. I could make up the guest room again." Grace looked at his hopeful face and felt her resolve crumble. "Okay," she said. "I'll stay." They ended up on the couch in Jake's living room, watching an old Western movie. Grace curled up on one end while Jake sat on the other, but gradually, they migrated toward each other until Grace was tucked against Jake's side, her head on his chest. "This is nice," she murmured, listening to his heartbeat. "Better than nice," Jake said, his arm tightening around her. They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other on the couch. Grace woke up sometime after midnight to find herself covered, with a soft blanket, Jake's arm still around her protectively. She looked up at his sleeping face, peaceful in the lamplight they'd left on. This good man who had been alone for so long, who had shown her nothing but kindness and patience, who had built her a garden and shared. 3 weeks after their first kiss by the creek, Grace and Jake had fallen into a new rhythm. Grace still came to cook his meals, but now she stayed longer, helping with ranch work or just talking on the porch as the sun set. They were careful, with each other, both aware that what was growing between them was precious and fragile. Jake had never been happier. Grace's presence had transformed not just his house, but his entire world. Colors seemed brighter, food tasted better, and he found himself whistling while he worked. He caught his ranch hands looking at him with curiosity, probably wondering what had put the spring in his step and the smile on his face. Grace was changing too. The hollow sadness that had shadowed her eyes since Tom's death was slowly being replaced by something warmer. She laughed more often, hummed while she cooked, and had even started talking about future plans, expanding the garden next spring, maybe learning to ride a horse. Then Grace's mother-in-law came to visit. It was a Thursday morning when Grace arrived at the ranch looking shaken. Jake took one look at her pale face and worried eyes and knew something was wrong. "What happened?" he asked immediately. "Carol's coming," Grace said, sinking into a kitchen chair. "Tom's mother. She's driving down from Austin this weekend and she wants to talk about my future." Jake felt a cold knot form in his stomach. "What kind of talk?" Grace ran her hands through her hair. "She thinks I'm making poor choices, living in that tiny apartment, working as a cook instead of finding a respectable job. She says I'm dishonoring Tom's memory by not moving back to Austin, where his family can take care of me." "Take care of you how?" Jake asked, though he was afraid he already knew the answer. "She wants me to move in with her and Harold, says a widow should be with family, not gallivanting around the countryside alone." Grace looked up at Jake with tears in her eyes. "Jake, she doesn't know about you, about us. If she finds out I've been..." That we've been... She'd disapprove, Jake finished quietly. She'd be horrified. Carol has very specific ideas about proper behavior for widows. According to her, I should be wearing black and visiting Tom's grave every week, and certainly not. Grace gestured, helplessly between them. Jake sat down across from her, his mind racing. What do you want to do? I don't know, Grace admitted. Part of me wants to tell her the truth, that I'm happy here, that I'm building something good with you, but part of me feels so guilty. What if she's right? What if I am dishonoring Tom's memory? Before Jake could respond, Grace continued. And then there's the practical stuff. Carol and Harold have money. They could help me get back on my feet financially, maybe help me go back to school or find a career. What can I offer them in return? What can I tell them about my life that sounds responsible and respectable? Jake felt like he'd been punched in the chest. You could tell them you're happy. Am I, though? Grace asked, and Jake's world tilted on its axis. I mean, yes, I'm happy when I'm with you, but Jake, look at this objectively. I'm 38 years old, working as a cook on an isolated ranch, falling for a man I've known for a few months. From the outside, it looks like I'm running away from real life. Is that what you think you're doing? Jake asked quietly. Grace met his eyes, and Jake saw confusion and pain there. I don't know anymore. When Tom died, I felt so lost. Coming, here being with you, it made me feel alive again. But maybe that was just because I was desperate for any kind of connection, any way to stop feeling like half a person. Each word was like a knife to Jake's heart, but he kept his face carefully neutral. He'd learned long ago to hide his pain, to protect himself from the inevitable moment when someone decided he wasn't enough. Maybe Carol's right, Grace continued. Maybe I should be with family, rebuilding my life properly instead of hiding out here playing house. Playing house, Jake repeated, his voice flat. Grace seemed to realize how that sounded. Jake, I didn't mean... Yes, you did, Jake said, standing up. And maybe you're right. Maybe this whole thing has been me taking advantage of someone who was vulnerable and grateful for kindness. That's not what I meant, Grace protested, isn't it? Jake asked. You just said you might have been desperate for any connection. Maybe I was just convenient. The first person to show you attention after Tom died. Grace stood up too, tears flowing freely now. Jake, please don't twist my words. I care about you, I do. But I'm so confused right now, and Carol's visit is forcing me to think about things I've been avoiding. What things? Like what people will think when they see us together. Like whether this relationship can survive in the real world, outside this little bubble we've created. Like whether I'm strong enough to handle the judgment that will come with being involved with someone who's so different from Tom. Jake flinched as if she'd slapped him. Different how? Because I'm bigger? Because I'm a rancher instead of a teacher? Because I don't fit into your old life? That's not fair, Grace said. You know that's not what I meant. Do I? Jake asked. Because it sounds like you're saying I'm good enough for a lonely widow who needed someone to make her feel human again, but not good enough for Grace Murphy when she's thinking clearly about her future. They stared at each other across the kitchen, the space between them suddenly feeling like a canyon. All the closeness they'd built over the past months seemed to crumble in the face of this first real conflict. I need some time, Grace said, finally. To think, to talk to Carol, to figure out what I really want. Jake nodded curtly. Take all the time you need. I'll manage my own meals while you're sorting out whether I'm worth the potential embarrassment of being seen with me. Jake? But he was already walking away, grabbing his hat from the hook by the door and striding out toward the barn without looking back. Grace stood alone in the kitchen they'd shared so many happy moments in, crying for the hurt she'd seen, in Jake's eyes and the fear in her own heart. The weekend with Carol was worse than Grace had imagined. Tom's mother arrived in her pristine Cadillac, took one look at Grace's small apartment, and immediately launched into a lecture about proper grief management and responsible decision-making. Darling, I know you're trying to be independent, but this simply isn't sustainable, Carol said, waving a dismissive hand at Grace's modest living space. Tom would want you to be taken care of, not struggling to make ends meet in some questionable job. It's not questionable, Grace said quietly. I cook for a local rancher. It's honest work. Carol's perfectly made-up face wrinkled in distaste. Cooking for some stranger instead of honoring your husband's memory by maintaining the dignity he would expect from his wife? Grace, you're better than this. Every conversation felt like an attack on the life Grace had been building. Carol criticized her clothes, her job, her decision to stay in the small town instead of moving back to Austin. She had plans for Grace, a respectable apartment near Tom's family, maybe a job at the bank where Harold had connections, certainly a return to the social circle where Tom's widow would be properly supported. You're still young enough to remarry eventually, Carol said over dinner, but only if you present yourself appropriately. This rustic phase you're going through isn't doing you any favors. Grace thought about Jake during every one of these conversations. She imagined introducing him to Carol, seeing the shock and disapproval on her mother-in-law's face. Jake would tower over Harold, making the refined older man look fragile and nervous. Carol would take in Jake's size, his work-roughened hands, his simple clothes, and immediately judge him as unsuitable. The worst part was that Grace could see it all so clearly because she was judging it herself. Not Jake, never Jake, but the situation, the improbability of it all, the complications. By Sunday evening, when Carol finally left with promises to make arrangements for Grace's move to Austin, Grace felt hollowed out and more confused than ever. She'd agreed to think about Carol's offer, mostly to end the constant pressure, but she knew she'd hurt Carol's feelings by not immediately accepting, and she knew she'd hurt Jake far worse by even considering it. Monday morning, Grace drove to the ranch with her heart in her throat. She'd spent the entire night rehearsing what she'd say to Jake, how she'd explain that Carol's visit had rattled her but hadn't changed how she felt about him. But Jake's truck wasn't in the driveway. Grace let herself into the house and found a note on the kitchen counter written in Jake's careful handwriting. Grace gone to Austin to look at cattle. Back Thursday. There's sandwich stuff in the fridge if you want to work this week. Jay. The formality of the note broke Grace's heart. No dear Grace, no mention of missing her, no invitation to stay for dinner or watch movies or any of the intimate routines they'd developed. Just the bare minimum communication between employer and employee. Grace spent the week cooking Jake's meals and leaving them in the refrigerator with heating instructions. She worked in the garden they'd planted together, tended his flowers, and tried to imagine what she'd say when he came back. By Wednesday, she knew what she had to do. Jake returned Thursday evening to find Grace waiting on his porch steps. She'd been there for hours, watching the sun set over land that had come to feel like home. He parked his truck and walked toward her slowly, his face carefully blank. Grace, hi Jake.